BF21 is sponsored by the Climate Council of Greater Kansas City and KKFI 90.1 FM, Kansas City Community Radio. This is Microplastics and the Environment. Please welcome your host, Rianon Wallace-Demby.
Hello, thank y'all for coming out to my presentation. My name is Rianon Wallace-Demby, and I am a senior at the University of Kansas. I've been studying ecology, evolutionary, and organismal biology, and I minored in Arabic. Today I'm going to be talking about microplastics in the environment. I do research at the Aquatic Ecology Lab that is located within the Kansas Biological Survey up on campus. So yeah, thank you for coming out, and gonna get started on today's presentation. Let me share my screen 1 second. Or can I get the permissions to go ahead and share my screen? Thanks. All right. All right, y'all, here we go. So, like I said, today I'm going to be covering microplastics and their effects on aquatic organisms and the environment. So you also have, during this webinar, y'all have the ability to raise your hands. And then, so using that, how many of y'all have heard of microplastics before? Hopefully some of y'all are raising your hands. And if not, by the end of today's presentation, I hope that you gain an understanding of what microplastics are, their effects on the environment, and kind of how we can work towards solutions. And if you have any questions for me, feel free to use the Q&A function on here. I will do my best to answer your questions throughout the presentation. If not, I'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So kind of just wanting to do a presentation like main points, going to define microplastics, go over some general statistics, talk about freshwater impacts, marine impacts, kind of go about what the impacts are on human health, some solutions that people have been working towards, and like I said, that Q&A if necessary. So what are microplastics? If you've ever used a beauty care product with microbeads in them before, which is a type of polyethylene plastic, keep that in mind. I will be bringing it up again later. Or if you've ever pulled loose fibers from your clothing, then chances are you are familiar with microplastics. But don't let the term micro trip you up. While small in nature, a lot of microplastics can be seen with our naked eye. And we typically define microplastics as particles that are smaller than 5 millimeters in size. For reference, a pea is about 10 millimeters in size. And we can break down microplastics further into two different main sources. You have your primary microplastics. Think of raw materials like resin pellets or microbeads, which are additives for personal care items. The other type of microplastic source is secondary. So secondary microplastics result from the degradation or breaking down of larger plastic items. This can be done through UV radiation and physical abrasion. And we can look at the photos on screen to kind of get a base understanding of what microplastics may look like if we were just to see them out and about. But it's also important to note that the study of microplastics is a fairly new field, starting in, I want to say the early 2000s, with most of the research focusing on the marine sector. And while that is extremely important work that needs to be done, the freshwater ecosystems largely get overlooked. So there's still so much that we don't know when it comes to microplastic impact in the freshwater sector. But within the past couple of years, a lot of studies have been coming out to kind of fill that knowledge gap. And it's also important to note that because it's new, we just don't know that much in regards to human health. We can speculate, but we just don't have all the answers or know necessarily what the specific impacts are. So let's define microplastics even further. There are 5 different types or like categories of microplastics. So let's talk about foam. This one is kind of obvious, if you will. Think styrofoam, food containers, like those to-go coffee cups that you get at convenience stores. This is what we mean by foam. We categorize these as secondary microplastics. And like I previously mentioned, secondary microplastics wind up in our ecosystems due to the breaking down of larger plastic items. Next, let's talk about fragments. Fragments are broken down pieces of larger plastic items. These are the type of plastics that you would see specifically from breaking down of things like plastic bottles, lids, single use items like takeout cutlery, straws, things like that. And the last type of secondary microplastic I want to bring up is microfibers. Now, keep this in mind. I will be getting to microfibers a little bit later on. Um, these can get into our environment through the simple act of washing our clothes. Did you know that a study conducted in 2016, researchers found that about 700,000 fibers could be released from a 13-pound load of laundry? Like it really makes you stop and think for a second, the sheer volume that could be in our waters. And I will touch more on that 2016 study later on because it's honestly kind of wild how washing our clothes can contribute that much to our ecosystems. Um, so I kind of want to shift gears from secondary microplastics to primary microplastics. So let's talk about microbeads. This is the one, like I've mentioned before, y'all are all probably familiar with. Um, I don't know about y'all, but I remember the early 2000s, like mid 2000s craze of microbeads and microbeads being put into like everything that we were using. Like I know some of y'all use that clean and clear, like morning burst microbead face cleanser because I was also one of them. So it's just like we couldn't escape, microbeads during that time. And they were in everything from like soaps to toothpaste. It was truly a wild time. So microbeads are non-biodegradable particles measuring about 1 millimeter in size. These often slip through wastewater treatment facilities and can end up in our freshwater and marine ecosystems. And the last type of primary microplastic is called nurdles. And I know it sounds completely weird. I almost didn't believe it myself, but nurdles is the legitimate term for this type of microplastic. These are typically plastic pellets that are made by manufacturers that can end up in our ecosystems by slipping out of like transport vehicles or from factory runoff. Think of nurdles like plastics, like little plastics that manufacturers melt down to make larger plastic items like plastic bottles or lids. Um, so how do microplastics get into our ecosystems? As I mentioned before, there are a host of ways that microplastics can get into our ecosystems, be it through the mundane task of washing our clothes to runoff from factories or slipping through the filters of sewage treatment plants. This image kind of gives us an idea on how to visualize these processes. Remember how I mentioned that microplastics can get into our waters through like waste treatment plants? If you look right here on this little like left-hand corner for me, um, we can kind of visualize how this begins to happen, with some microplastics washing into our rivers, which can later flow into our oceans, or how they can run down and get stuck in the surrounding land. So if you follow the little like colorful microplastics, you can kind of see how they go through the rivers, get into the oceans, and then like can sometimes get back onto land. A 2017 scientific study found that a huge contributor to microplastics in the terrestrial environment was through sewage sludge, containing synthetic fibers and sediment microplastics from personal care. And then I briefly touched on how UV radiation can contribute to the breaking down of larger plastic items. You can kind of like see that right up here. Um, and these microplastics, like I mentioned before, can be taken up through our ecosystems and incorporated into the food web of the aquatic organisms. You can see the little fish right here, taking them for food. Okay, we got a question. If microplastics get into the water via laundry, what type of clothes should I not be buying? That's a good question. I'm going to try to touch on that a little bit later on in our like solutions section, if you will. So good question. Keep that in mind, and I will get to that. All right, y'all. So let's talk about statistics. I am not a math person. I am not a statistics person. So if the math is not mathing in some sections, don't blame me, that's the studies. So here we go. So when it comes to determining natural concentrations of microplastics, it can be a bit tricky to come to a conclusive agreement. As scientists will either measure by like volume in sediment, volume in water. We just don't have like a universal like agreement on how to measure these things. Some studies have showcased that microbeads are the dominant form of microplastics in the environment, while others state that it is actually microfibers. However, we can kind of get a general idea of what that natural occurrence may look like as we dive into our next studies. So what I have on screen right now was a 2019 study that was conducted on the Mediterranean Sea. This study came out of Barcelona, and it looked at the natural occurrence of microplastics in the Mediterranean Sea. So we have a breakdown of what they found. So 54.5% of plastics were found to be microbeads. And if you see here on screen, kind of try to keep concise with the images. There are those microbeads that I mentioned before. These are called polyethylene or PE plastics. 16.5% of plastics found were polypropylene or PP plastics. These are your plastic bottle caps and plastic bottles. These are those fragments that I was talking about earlier. Lastly, 9.7% of plastics were found to be polyester, polystyrene, or PS plastics. These are your yarns, threads, and clothes, kind of like the microfibers that I was mentioning earlier. And so even though this study was focused on the Mediterranean Sea specifically, we can use it to kind of infer about what natural concentrations could look like in other aquatic environments. Okay. So let's move on to our next study. Remember that number I gave earlier stating that about 700,000 microfibers can be released from a 13-pound load of laundry? So let's dig a little deeper into that specific study that was conducted in 2016 and came out of England. Scientists found we're identifying that washing clothes made from synthetic fibers was potentially an important source of microfibers in the environment. So what exactly did they find? Like I mentioned, 700,000 fibers can be released from an average 13-pound load of laundry. breaking this down further, and like I said, if the math is not math, and this is not on me. So acrylic was estimated to be about 728,000 fibers, coming in at about 53.5%. Polyester was found to be 496,000 fibers, coming in at 36.4%, and a polyester cotton blend coming in at 137,000 fibers, or 10.1%. And it also found that a single garment could produce about 1,900 fibers, which is really, really wild when you think about it, since laundry is something we all do. It's a constant, and it makes you just think of the sheer volume of microfibers that can be out there just from us washing our clothes. So you may be thinking, Rihanna, didn't you say there could be 700,000 fibers released per wash, but the breakdown is giving us more than that? Like, yes, I know it may be a little bit confusing, but these are approximations of what that total 700,000 could be made up of. So if y'all have, let me see if there are any more questions. If not, I will begin to move to the next couple of sections. All right, so we're gonna get into impacts on freshwater organisms. So I bet y'all have some questions as to what you're looking at on screen, but don't worry, like I'll try to make some sense of it. So I mentioned earlier that I do research on microplastics and have been studying microplastics for the past couple of years. So I'm gonna bring my little research into it for a moment. So what we have here are pictures of Daphnia magna, a type of zooplankton that I am currently doing research on. In these images, we can see the location of where microplastics are getting lodged within the organism. So kind of like pay attention to those neon pink dots. These images were taken on a type of fluorescent microscope in one of the KU labs. So, like I said, at the moment, my current research focuses on microplastic effects on Daphnia magna. Um, I'm kind of looking to see where microplastics are getting lodged in their gastrointestinal tracts. We're talking like upper GI versus lower GI. And if you look on screen, you can kind of see where the microplastics have already like begun to get lodged. You can kind of see them right here in the upper GI. I think these images are really, really cool, and that you could see like specifically where this is getting lodged. Another area of interest to me is the trophic level transfer of microplastics between organisms. And what that means, for those who may be unfamiliar, is so when one organism eats another organism, will the microplastics transfer from one to the other? For this part of the experiment and not pictured on screen, I'm using a ghost shrimp to see if the plastics transfer when they ingest the Daphnia. Um, a study that kind of like backs up what I'm looking at that was presented at the 2019 Society for Freshwater Science conference that I attended showcase that these microplastics were getting into the gills of aquatic organisms like mussels. This means their filtration rates of water decreases. And this study also saw evidence of internal tissue damage being done by microplastics. Um, what this means with microplastics getting into their gills and getting caught in the upper GI of these organisms is that it could lead to suffocation. And so we have to be really pay attention to what we're putting out in the environment and what's going on, because there's a lot of negative effects. Another Going on to a couple other impacts of microplastics on these freshwater organisms are that microplastics can be a substrate for harmful bacteria and pollutants. This means it can be easier for aquatic organisms to absorb these harmful materials because like toxins and pollutants can easily stick to microplastics, which makes them a mode of transport for these things. This is obviously by no means an expansive list of all the ways in which microplastics can impact freshwater organisms, but we can cover what has recently been studied. We can see some changes in behavioral responses and reduced swimming performance. We've also seen some reduced feeding rates, reduced body mass, reduced allocation for energy growth, so more stunted organisms, decreased predatory performance, as well as larval abnormalities and decreased fertilization. Let's see, we got another question, so let me try to answer that. Could the microplastics transfer to us? Yes, so I will get to that more in the human health segment of this talk, but keep that in mind. I will get to it, but thank you for that question. So let us move on to the next one. So we're going to kind of talk about impacts on marine organisms. So this was a really interesting figure that I thought I'd bring up. Did you know that a 2015 study found that about 8 million tons of plastic enter our oceans each year? That's wild to me. I have a hard time visualizing what exactly that means. That's truly wild numbers, but it kind of gives you the idea of just how much we're contributing to pollution in our oceans. Microplastics are considered to be xenobiotics. And I really want to break that down really quickly so y'all understand what I'm talking about. Xenobiotics are defined as either a naturally occurring or synthetic compound that interfere with the functioning of the endocrine system, causing unnatural responses. And as a little refresher, this is a system that regulates tissue function, metabolism, growth, and hormones, to name a few things. This can be very, very dangerous as marine organisms, much like freshwater aquatic organisms, do not possess the specific enzymes to break down synthetic polymers. And much like we covered in our freshwater impacts, marine organisms can also experience a lot of cellular and tissue damage, as well as mortality. And on an ecosystem level, we've begun to see that the introduction of microplastics into these communities can also alter behavior patterns and habits of population structures. So impacts on human health. So this is kind of where, like, I really want to preface this by we don't have all the data yet. We just don't have all the data yet. I can provide speculation on like what these human health impacts can be, but this field hasn't been around long enough to give us like solid data, solid impacts, all of that. So I want to start off kind of by mentioning the World Health Organization found that in our drinking water, fragments, which were those little pieces of larger plastic items, as well as fibers from our clothes and things like that, were the predominant particle shapes that were found in our waters. Microplastics have been found in seafoods such as fish, shellfish, sea salt. I thought I was safe because I'm horribly allergic to like seafood and stuff like that. So I was like, oh, I'm fine because I don't eat anything like that. But it's really showing up everywhere from, like I said, from sea salt to even being recently found in honey. Because like I mentioned, microplastics act as a substrate and pollutants and additives can be transferred from and ingested with those plastics. This could possibly lead to a spread of pathogens, which would increase global risk of human and animal disease. Um, the survival of pathogens on plastic debris, though, has not extensively been studied and is still unknown to like what extent microplastics play in the spread of infectious disease. Another thing that we can look at is microplastic rain. Yeah, like nothing is safe. A 2020 study that was done estimated that 1,000 tons or the equivalent of 123 million plastic bottles rain down on protected areas in the Western US each year. Um, and also, as of, I think it was a 2020 study that found or actually, forgive me, a 2021 study that saw that microplastics are beginning to be found in human placentas. Not entirely sure what that means, but you can kind of get an idea. Got another question, so let me go ahead and answer that. How does this impact our economy and economic systems, nationally or worldwide? That's a really good question. I'll try to get to this after the solutions one. But yeah, I'm not as familiar with the economic sector, but we can kind of like speculate on it. But that's a really good question, and thank you for asking. So let me move on to our last section. Solutions, question mark. So I know that this was a lot of information to take in, and I truly appreciate y'all sticking with me throughout this. It can be overwhelming to kind of take in all of this and about how microplastics are harming our environments, can have potential effects on us. And I know as y'all been asking, your mind may be swimming with questions about like, what can we do to help combat this? And like, fret not, people are actively working on solutions on how we can begin to start making changes. First, let me talk about the banning of microplastics in countries such as the US, UK, and Canada. We have the Microbead Free Waters Act of 2015. This act prohibits the manufacturing, packing, and distribution of microbeads in cosmetics, as well as non prescriptions over the counters, such as toothpaste. And like I said, we were truly wilding in the mid 2000s with that microbead craze because they were everywhere. But luckily, we are beginning to remedy that fad that we were going through. Another way to people are trying to combat this is through sustainable fashion. So this is a movement towards minimizing the impact fashion has on the environment, and this is kind of looking at, I guess, kind of goes into the economic question. This is looking at like the consumers, but as well as putting more pressure on these big corporation fast fashion industries. Um, so it's they're trying to minimize their like fashion's footprint through reducing textile waste, reducing chemical use in clothing, and combating the fast, like I said, fast fashion, like Forever 21, Fashion Nova, Zara, all of that. While this is a good option, we do have to keep in mind that on the consumer's part, this may not necessarily be obtainable for everyone because a lot of like eco-friendly fabrics and clothing brands are very, very pricey. So we just kind of have to keep that in mind as we're moving forward. Another thing has been reducing single-use items. So think about those plastic straw bands that we have seen in the past couple of years. This was one, a very large scale effort to reduce straws in our environments because they are one of the things that um, contribute to secondary microplastics. This in turn led a surge in reusable straws, but we have to be mindful how we navigate these single use items because a lot of the mobility of the plastic straws to bend, move, what have you, was very good for those with chronic illness and disabilities. So as we think of these solutions, we have to really be conscious with how we're doing it and how we move forward. Because while, yes, this may help one situation, it could be alienating and isolating another group of people. So we really got to keep this in mind as we're going forward. And then lastly, I want to touch on the advanced wastewater treatment technologies. Um, so people are looking right now into like advancing wastewater treatment in order to reduce microplastic waste effluent. So like I mentioned before, a lot of microplastics, microbeads, whatever, slip through these wastewater treatment plants. And while they do their best to catch it, it is just impossible with how tiny some of these are. And so people are doing studies currently to try to remedy that and make our filtering technologies even stronger. And just because I also want to make clear, I use the word fluent, and it's defined as an outflowing of water or gas to a natural body of water from a structure such as a treatment plant, sewer pipe, or industrial outfall. So let me get to the questions. Um, so yeah, let's see. Okay, so just want to make sure I cover the bases with previously asked questions. If microplastics are getting into water via laundry, what type of clothes should I not be buying? I was actually reading up one of the ways to kind of like combat this is like steady, instead of, I want to say like washing or drying your clothes in the laundry, they also recommend like hang drying your clothing that can reduce a lot of microfibers that are getting into our environment. And we covered how microplastics could transfer to us and kind of like how it would impact our economic systems. Let's see. Got another question. Just curious, could the microplastics be collected into green plants via soil, probably into the human body? Yeah. So microplastics are getting, there's that uptake of microplastics um, through soil because of runoff from factories and slipping through um, water treatment facilities. And think of if we have a river or a waterbed that's full of microplastics and we experience a flood, that floodplain could absorb a lot of those microplastics, and those could be getting into our soils and things like that. Um, I assume that it can get into plants, not a plant expert, but we can speculate. So yeah. Um, Let's see. It seems that microplastics are here to stay. Due to its widespread use, can you speculate whether microplastics are a good thing or a bad thing? Microplastics, microplastics are really not the best. We have to like think towards sustainable solutions, but like how can we do that ethically? Because it's gonna take a lot. Like this isn't, an overnight solution. It's gonna take a lot of effort to really begin to cut down on microplastics. Like the reason we haven't been seeing as many like human effects or I guess like accumulation right now is because we have like the stomach acids and stuff to break them down, whereas marine and aquatic organisms don't. But if we aren't preserving and taking care of our aquatic ecosystems, this could really, really hurt us in ways that we just don't know yet. But yeah, we would have to work towards finding more solutions, finding more sustainable and ethical solutions to combat these microplastics. Um, is there an ecoplastic or free rating for clothes? That I'm not familiar with. There are like I don't know if you meant like or talking about like eco-friendly textiles or like what type of textiles. I know one of the bigger things that has been found is like hemp clothing. And I've seen Nike also do stuff out of like, make shoes out of like corkboard and things like that. So I would have to do more research into that one, but there are definitely options out there and more options are coming up across the board. Is there any national legislation that would ban certain plastics? Yeah, so I briefly mentioned the Microbead Free Waters Act of 2015, and this one was aimed at taking out microbeads from cosmetics and over the counters. Another legislation that was pretty big push in the past couple of years was the plastic straw ban. So that was one, it was met with a lot of pushback, but that was one that like states were starting to go through and create bans on these items. And I think I have seen like more studies coming up with like different bans on like maybe working towards single use item bans, things like that. But I would have to do a little bit more research on what specific legislation is out there right now that are pertaining to plastics. But let me you have covered this a bit in your slides. Could you please give some more suggestions to us as members of this planet about things we could do to make things better? Sure. I can give a couple little suggestions here. One thing is and I'm pretty sure all y'all are pretty familiar with the reducing our own personal plastic waste. So like I try to reduce how I use plastic straws through reusable metal or like washable hard plastic straws. Also, like, we have our reusable water bottles to cut down just on how much plastic is going into our environment. If it is something that is doable for you, please look into sustainable fashions. Growing up, we had a lot of hand-me-downs, things like that. Like y'all can often catch me wearing my like grandpa's sweater or like my mom's shirts and stuff from the 90s, just, keeping that going and not contributing as much to fashion, which is honestly very like easier said than done. And then yeah, it's just we can also kind of the way in which we wash and dry our clothes. I was seeing some stuff about, washing our clothes less. So like maybe instead of like if you wash clothes like every day, if somebody washes clothes every day, then do it less or something, instead of using your dryer, try to hang dry as much as possible. Um, yeah, there's a lot of little things that are out there, and I encourage y'all to look into some more of these things that we can do to reduce our plastic waste ourselves. But hopefully, we can work towards better solutions of like really getting in like with these wastewater treatment advancements. I've been seeing people creating like litter nets that they have put in rivers to kind of like collect bigger plastic items which could help if we could get those bigger plastic items out, we would reduce kind of the degradation and the creation of those fragment microplastics that I was talking about. But yeah, if that's all the questions that y'all have, this is all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for sticking with me and for coming to my talk today. This was my very first presentation, so thank y'all for sitting through this with me. I hope you learned something new and kind of gained an idea of how we can work towards combating microplastics in our environment. Let's see, we have, oh, thank y'all gassing me up in the comments. Okay, thank y'all for gassing me up in this Q&A. I tried, it is what it is. But thank y'all so much for coming out. I truly appreciate it. If y'all want to reach out to me, you can always send a message to the EF 21 and they can forward anything to me. Y'all can reach me at my KU email, which is r679w917@ku.edu. I never got around to making it any easier than those numbers because I am trying to get through my degree. So thank y'all for stopping by. I'm glad that y'all appreciated this presentation, and I hope you have a good rest of your Sunday. Thank you so much.